I never imagined the day I'd find myself hiding in my own home, but there I was, heart racing as my husband's footsteps echoed down the hall. My hands trembled, gripping the edge of the door. On the other side was a truth too explosive to face, a truth that would shatter the perfect life I thought we had. And then his voice pierced the silence, calling my name. We were the perfect family, or at least that's what everyone believed. My name is Sarah, and I had spent the last 12 years building a life with Mark. He was the kind of husband others envied, charming, attentive, and fiercely ambitious. Together, we had 2 beautiful children and a house that always seemed to echo with laughter. But behind the smiles and social gatherings, cracks had started to form. Mark worked late more often, his phone always glued to his hand. I brushed it off as stress from work, reassuring myself that he was doing it all for us. I wanted to believe that the late nights and the distant looks were temporary, just a phase we'd get through. At first, I found comfort in the small rituals that held us together. Saturday mornings spent in bed with coffee, planning the week ahead, or the way he'd kiss my forehead before leaving for work. But over time, those moments became rare, replaced by cold silences and hurried goodbyes. Still, I clung to the memories of what we had, convincing myself that love like ours didn't just fade away. Then there was Emily. She was my best friend, someone I trusted like a sister. Our kids played together, and we shared everything, or so I thought. Emily had been a part of my life for as long as I could remember, always there with a kind word or a glass of wine when I needed to vent. I never once doubted her loyalty. Looking back, there were signs I missed, moments that now seemed glaringly obvious. The way she avoided eye contact when Mark's name came up, the sudden distance in her once warm demeanor. But at the time, I was too focused on holding my marriage together to notice the web of deceit weaving itself around me. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when the first real crack appeared. Mark had come home late again, his shirt smelling faintly of perfume. I asked him about it, my voice calm but my heart pounding. He laughed it off, saying I was imagining things, and kissed me on the cheek like nothing was wrong. I wanted to believe him, but something in my gut told me that the life I had built was on the verge of crumbling. It started small, tiny details that seemed insignificant at first but began to pile up, forming a picture I couldn't ignore. Mark's late-night phone calls became more frequent, always accompanied by vague excuses. It's work, he'd say, or just a client. But the tone of his voice changed when he answered, softer, almost tender. I told myself I was being paranoid, that stress was clouding my judgment. But then there was the lipstick stain. One night, as I was folding his laundry, I found a faint smudge on the collar of his shirt. My stomach twisted as I held it up to the light, the vibrant red mocking me. When I confronted him, his response was quick and dismissive. It must have been from someone at the office, he said, shrugging it off like it was nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like the beginning of the end. Emily's behavior added to my growing unease. She stopped coming over as often and became oddly distant during our conversations. Whenever I mentioned Mark, her smile would falter, and she'd change the subject. It was unlike her, Emily, who once knew every detail of my life, now seemed to avoid my gaze. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a picture, posted by one of Emily's friends, of a dinner party I hadn't been invited to. There was Emily laughing, and beside her Mark. His arm was casually draped over the back of her chair, their smiles a little too close, a little too familiar. My heart sank as I stared at the screen, the image burning itself into my mind. I couldn't sleep that night. The nagging suspicion that something was happening right under my nose refused to let me rest. Memories of every late-night text, every unexplained absence came rushing back, and I began to question everything. Was I losing my mind, or was the man I loved hiding something from me? And worse, was Emily part of it? The next morning, I decided to look through Mark's phone. It was something I had promised myself I'd never do, but desperation had a way of breaking promises. As he showered, I unlocked his phone, my hands trembling. My heart raced as I scrolled through his messages, searching for anything that would confirm my fears. And then I found it. A string of texts between him and an unsaved number. The messages were casual at first, work-related, or so it seemed. But as I kept scrolling, the tone changed. Words like "miss you" and "last night was incredible" leapt off the screen, each one a dagger to my chest. The final message was a picture, a selfie of Emily, her lips painted the same red as the stain on his shirt. My hands shook as I set the phone down, the weight of what I'd discovered crashing down on me. It wasn't just Mark's betrayal. It was Emily's too. The two people I trusted most had been conspiring behind my back, building their own world at the expense of mine. I sat there, frozen, as a mix of anger and heartbreak consumed me. I wanted to confront them both, to demand answers, but a part of me hesitated. I needed more proof, something undeniable. And so I decided to wait, to watch, and to uncover the full truth. But waiting came at a price. With every passing day, my suspicions grew, poisoning every interaction, every conversation. I couldn't look at Mark without wondering if he was lying, couldn't hear Emily's voice without feeling the sting of betrayal. The life I had known was slipping through my fingers, and I was powerless to stop it. The days that followed were a torment, each moment heavier than the last. Mark was his usual self, laughing with the kids, kissing me on the cheek before leaving for work. But now, every touch felt like a lie, every smile a mask hiding the truth. I found myself watching him, studying every move he made, every glance, every word. Was it real, or was he acting? Emily, too, became a puzzle I couldn't solve. When we finally met for coffee after weeks of avoidance, I couldn't ignore the tension in the air. She was fidgety, her eyes darting around the cafe as if searching for an escape. "You've been distant lately," I said, keeping my voice light, though the accusation was clear. She laughed it off, claiming work had been overwhelming, but I could see through her excuses. The woman I had once confided in now felt like a stranger. And yet, there was a moment, a fleeting second, that left me reeling. As we hugged goodbye, her arms lingered a little too long, her grip firmer than usual. Her lips brushed my cheek, and I caught a faint, familiar scent, Mark's cologne. My heart skipped a beat as I pulled away, my mind racing. Was it a coincidence? A trick of my imagination? Or was it a confirmation of what I already knew? That night, I couldn't keep my thoughts to myself any longer. "Do you think Emily's acting strange?" I asked Mark as we lay in bed. He barely glanced up from his phone, his expression unreadable. "Not really," he said with a shrug. "Why?" His response was so casual, so dismissive, that it only fueled my suspicions. I wanted to scream at him, to demand the truth, but I bit my tongue. I needed more than just a feeling. I needed proof. The next day, an opportunity presented itself. Mark had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he went to pick up the kids. My hands trembled as I picked it up, scrolling through his call log and messages. And there it was, another text from Emily. This time it wasn't just words. It was a photo of her sitting in her car, lips parted in a sultry smile, with the caption, "Can't stop thinking about last night." I felt a surge of anger so intense it took my breath away. My mind raced with images of the two of them together, their stolen moments, their secret world. But then something shifted. Beneath the anger was a different emotion, one I didn't want to admit to myself: curiosity. What was it about her that had drawn him in? Was it the way she looked at him, or something deeper, something I had overlooked? The days turned into weeks, and my obsession with uncovering the truth consumed me. I began to notice things I hadn't before: the way Emily laughed a little too hard at Mark's jokes, the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought I wasn't looking. It was maddening, watching them dance around their secret while I pretended not to notice. And then, one evening, everything changed. Mark had gone to bed early, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I sat on the couch, staring at the flickering light of the television, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily. "Can we talk? It's important." My heart raced as I typed out a response, agreeing to meet her at our usual spot, a quiet park near her house. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting on a bench beneath the soft glow of a street lamp. She looked nervous, her hands twisting in her lap. "I don't know how to say this," she began, her voice trembling. "But I think you deserve to know the truth." For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she was going to confess, to come clean about everything. But what she said next left me speechless. "I've been struggling with feelings I don't understand," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "Feelings for you." My breath caught in my throat as her words sank in. This wasn't what I had expected. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Was this a distraction? A ploy to shift my suspicions? Or was she being honest? The vulnerability in her voice, the way her eyes searched mine for a reaction. It felt real, too real. I should have walked away, should have told her this was wrong. But instead, I found myself leaning closer, drawn to her in a way I couldn't explain. When her hand brushed against mine, I didn't pull away. And when she leaned in, her lips inches from mine, I closed the distance. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened, fueled by a mix of anger, betrayal, and something I couldn't name. For that moment, All the pain and confusion faded away, replaced by a fire that burned through every rational thought. It was reckless, dangerous, but I couldn't stop myself. When we finally pulled apart, her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and desire. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking. But I wasn't. For the first time in weeks, I felt alive, and I wasn't ready to let go. The days that followed my encounter with Emily were a whirlwind of emotion. Guilt, desire, and anger twisted inside me like a storm I couldn't contain. I avoided Mark, claiming headaches or errands to keep my distance. Emily, too, kept her distance, but her absence only heightened my longing and confusion. What had started as a suspicion had spiraled into something I couldn't control, and the weight of it was suffocating. One evening, I decided I needed clarity. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, not when the truth was just within reach. Mark had left his laptop open on the kitchen table, the screen still glowing. He had always been careful about his passwords, but I had learned enough about his habits to guess them. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard, a mix of adrenaline and dread coursing through me. With a deep breath, I typed in his most obvious choice: our wedding anniversary. The screen unlocked. I found myself staring at his email inbox, the rows of unread messages taunting me. Scanning the subject lines, I noticed one that made my heart stop. Last night was unforgettable. It was from Emily. My hands trembled as I clicked on it, the message opening to reveal a thread of emails that confirmed every fear I had been harboring. The messages were explicit, detailing their meetings, their plans, and their feelings for each other. Each word was a knife to my chest, cutting deeper than the last. But as I scrolled, I found something even more damning. A thread of emails that hinted at an upcoming trip, just the two of them. They had planned to leave together, to escape the lives they had built and start anew. Tears blurred my vision as I closed the laptop. My entire world had come crashing down, and I was left standing in the wreckage. The betrayal was more than I could bear, but the anger that followed was what truly consumed me. They thought they could do this behind my back, thought they could tear my life apart without consequence. I decided then that I wouldn't be the victim. I wouldn't let them control the narrative of my life. If they wanted to play games, I would show them just how far I was willing to go. The following day, I made a call to Emily. My voice was steady, calm, a stark contrast to the chaos inside me. "Can we talk?" I asked, knowing she couldn't refuse. We agreed to meet at her house that evening, and as I hung up, I felt a surge of power. This was my chance to take back control. When I arrived, she greeted me with a nervous smile, her eyes darting toward the doorway as if expecting someone to walk in. "Mark's not here, is he?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, stepping inside. The air between us was charged, a tension neither of us could ignore. "Emily," I began, my voice firm. "I know about you and Mark." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't deny it. I've seen the messages, the pictures. I know everything." She crumpled into a chair, her head in her hands. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice trembling. It just did. I wanted to scream at her, to lash out, but instead, I took a step closer, forcing her to look at me. "Why, Emily? Why would you do this to me? To us?" The betrayal was etched in every word, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she admitted. "I was lonely, and Mark, he made me feel seen in a way I haven't felt in years." Her words stung, but they also struck a chord deep within me. I had been feeling the same way, unseen, unheard, unloved. It didn't excuse what she had done, but it made me realize how fractured my own life had become. Before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the silence. Emily's eyes widened in fear. "It's Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My heart raced as I turned toward the door, every nerve in my body on high alert. The door swung open, and there he was, his face a mix of shock and confusion as he took in the scene before him. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice sharp. I stepped forward, my eyes locking onto his. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "All three of us." For the first time, I saw fear in Mark's eyes. He knew the game was up, knew he couldn't talk his way out of this one. He glanced at Emily, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "What do you want me to say?" he finally asked, his voice laced with defeat. "The truth," I replied. "No more lies, no more excuses. I want to know everything." And so they told me. Piece by piece, the story of their affair unfolded, each revelation more painful than the last. The late-night texts, the secret meetings, the lies they had both told to keep their secret hidden. By the time they finished, I felt hollow, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on me like a crushing force. But I didn't let it break me. Instead, I stood tall, looking them both in the eye. "You've taken so much from me," I said, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "But you won't take my dignity. You won't take my strength." With that, I turned and walked out the door, leaving them to face the consequences of their actions. The pain was still there, raw and unrelenting, but as I stepped into the cool night air, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. This wasn't the end, it was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild and rediscover who I was. And as I drove away, the tears streaming down my face were no longer just tears of heartbreak. They were tears of freedom, of strength, and of hope for the future that lay ahead. The days after my confrontation with Mark and Emily were a blur of raw emotion and difficult decisions. The house, once filled with laughter and the comforting rhythm of family life, now felt like a battlefield. Mark tried to talk to me, his apologies tumbling out in frantic waves, but I wasn't ready to hear them. Every time he opened his mouth, all I could see were the lies, the betrayal etched into his every word. I couldn't bring myself to look at Emily. She called, texted, even showed up at the house once, but I ignored her. Her betrayal felt sharper, more personal. She hadn't just stolen my husband. She had stolen my trust, my sense of security. The weight of her actions crushed me in ways I couldn't yet articulate. The kids noticed the change, of course. "Is Daddy mad at you?" my youngest asked one evening as I tucked him into bed. I forced a smile, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "No, sweetie," I said softly. "Daddy and I just need some time to figure things out." But inside, I felt like I was unraveling. How could I protect them from this storm when I was barely holding myself together? Mark moved into the guest room after that night. It was a small act, a physical acknowledgement of the chasm that had opened between us. I told him I needed space to think, to process everything. He agreed, but his presence in the house was a constant reminder of what had happened, of what I had lost. One night, after putting the kids to bed, I found myself sitting in the kitchen, a glass of wine in hand. The silence was deafening, the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me. I replayed every moment in my mind, the stolen glances, the late-night texts, the excuses. How had I missed the signs? How had I let this happen to my family? I considered leaving, packing up the kids and starting fresh somewhere far away. But the thought of uprooting their lives felt unbearable. This was their home, their safe space, and I wasn't ready to take that away from them. Instead, I began to focus on myself. I started therapy, pouring out my pain and confusion to someone who wouldn't judge me, who wouldn't tell me what I already knew. The sessions were hard, but they were necessary. For the first time, I began to see the cracks that had formed long before Emily entered the picture. Mark's betrayal was devastating, but it wasn't the sole reason for our marriage's unraveling. We had both let things slip, had both stopped seeing each other in the way we once did. That realization didn't excuse his actions, but it gave me a sense of clarity I desperately needed. Emily, meanwhile, seemed to disappear. Mutual friends stopped mentioning her, and I avoided the places where I knew she might be. The few times I did see her, once at the grocery store, another time at a neighborhood event, she looked just as haunted as I felt. But I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Mark and I began the slow, painful process of untangling our lives. We talked about counseling, about whether there was any chance of salvaging what we had left. But every conversation felt like walking through a minefield, every word loaded with the weight of what had happened. Some days, it felt like we were making progress. Other days, it felt like we were simply delaying the inevitable. The hardest part was facing the questions from family and friends. They noticed the changes, the way Mark and I avoided each other at gatherings, the forced smiles we wore when asked how we were doing. "Is everything okay?" my sister asked one afternoon, her eyes filled with concern. I wanted to tell her everything, to unload the burden I had been carrying. But instead, I simply nodded, forcing a smile. "We're working on it," I said. It was all I could manage. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the pain began to dull. It didn't disappear. I wasn't sure it ever would, but it became more manageable. I threw myself into work, into parenting, into rebuilding a sense of normalcy for my children. Mark stayed in the guest room, his presence a constant reminder of the choices we had both made. We weren't a family anymore, not in the way we once were, but we were trying. One evening, as I was sorting through old photos, I found one of us from the early days of our marriage. We were laughing, arms wrapped around each other, the world at our feet. I stared at the photo for a long time, tears streaming down my face. I missed that version of us, the couple who believed they could conquer anything. But that version was gone, replaced by two people who had been broken by their own flaws and the choices they had made. In the end, I knew there was no going back. Too much had been said, too much had been done. But there was also a strange sense of hope, a belief that I could rebuild, that I could find a new version of happiness. It wouldn't be the life I had planned, but it could still be a life worth living. As I packed away the photo, I took a deep breath, a small smile tugging at the corners of my lips. This wasn't the end of my story. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would write my own ending. Months later, life had taken on a new rhythm. It wasn't the same, but it was stable. The chaos that had once consumed my days had given way to a cautious peace. Mark and I had agreed to separate. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. We had both realized that the damage done couldn't be undone, and trying to force a reconciliation would only hurt us, and our children, even more. The kids struggled at first, of course. Questions like, "Why doesn't Daddy sleep in your room anymore?" or "Why is Emily not coming around?" were hard to answer. I kept my explanations honest but simple, focusing on their need for security rather than burdening them with the complicated truths. "Sometimes adults make mistakes," I told them. "But we still love you more than anything, and that will never change." Therapy became a cornerstone of my healing. It taught me to confront my pain instead of burying it, to accept my emotions without letting them define me. Slowly, I began to let go of the anger that had once consumed me. Forgiving Mark and Emily wasn't about excusing their actions. It was about freeing myself from the weight of their betrayal. One evening, while journaling, I reflected on how far I had come. The Sarah who had been blindsided by her husband's affair felt like a different person, fragile, unsure, broken. But now I was stronger. I had rediscovered parts of myself I had forgotten in the years of being a wife and mother. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. It became my sanctuary, a way to express the emotions I couldn't put into words. As for Mark, he seemed to be grappling with his own guilt. He remained involved in the kids' lives, showing up for every soccer game, every school play. But there was a distance between us now, a polite formality that replaced the intimacy we once shared. He apologized often, too often, but I learned to accept his words without letting them reopen old wounds. Emily's presence in my life had vanished completely. The last I heard, she had moved out of town, leaving behind the web of relationships she had tangled herself in. I didn't hate her anymore. In a way, I pitied her. She had been searching for something she couldn't find in herself, just as Mark had. Their choices had destroyed a part of me, but I refused to let them define my future. What stayed with me the most were the lessons I had learned. Trust is a fragile thing, something that takes years to build but only moments to shatter. I learned the importance of communication, of speaking up when something feels wrong instead of letting silence build walls. And most importantly, I learned the value of self-respect, that loving someone else should never come at the expense of loving yourself. One day, while walking through the park with my kids, I felt a sense of clarity wash over me. The sun was shining, laughter echoed in the air, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was mine, and I was determined to make the most of it. As we sat on a bench, watching the kids play, my eldest turned to me and asked, "Are you happy, Mom?" I smiled, the weight of the past lifting just a little more. "I'm getting there," I said. And for the first time, I believed it. In the end, the betrayal had broken me, but it had also forced me to grow. It had taught me to face my fears, to rebuild myself piece by piece. And as painful as it had been, it had given me the strength to move forward, to create a new life on my own terms. For that, I was grateful. If you were in Sarah's shoes, what would you have done? Do you believe forgiveness is possible after such a betrayal, or is walking away the only answer? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more gripping stories like this. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.